Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Dr. Brian Cutter from the University of Notre Dame to talk about arguments for and against physicalism. Thanks for joining me, Dr. Cutter.
Happy to be here.
Brian, from now on. What is physicalism?
Good. So physicalism can be understood as a global view about all reality or a kind of local view about the human person or the human mind. Considered as a global view, basically the thought would be that all things are physical, or the physical truths in some sense exhaust all the truths. There's different ways of making that precise. So one version would be in modal terms, to say that all positive truths supervene on the physical truths, or all positive truths are metaphysically necessitated by the physical truths. There are ground theoretic formulations that would say every positive truth either is a physical truth or is fully grounded in some collection of physical truths. But the general idea would be that in some sense the physical truths provide an exhaustive characterization of reality. When it comes to physicalism as a thesis specifically about the mind, you would restrict that claim to mental truths. So you could define it as a claim that every positive mental truth is metaphysically necessitated by some collection of physical truths or fully grounded in some collection of physical truths. But in some sense, physicalism about the mind would be the thought that all mental facts, properties, entities would be fully constituted by or grounded in the physical.
Sweet. So in terms of characterizing the physical, that's a bit tricky, but is it something like what an ideal completed physics would recognize or posit, or how are you understanding physical?
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue that I don't know if there's a consensus view about the best way of characterizing what it is for a truth to be physical. But yeah, one standard approach would say, yeah, this is the kind of truth that would figure in an idealized or completed physics. And usually there's some qualifications. So one issue that comes up is, well, what if ideal completed physics postulates angels or God or some primitively mental entities that explain why electrons swerve or whatever? Intuitively, that would not be a physicalist world, and yet it's posited under this hypothesis by the ideal physics. Sometimes a stipulation is added. So long as ideal physics doesn't include any primitively mental entities, or so long as completed physics is restricted to purely structural truths, which have to do with kind of spatiotemporal organization and kind of causal interactions among elements, maybe mathematical structure. So basically, we want to stipulate that physicalism somehow rules out fundamental mentality. And there's different ways of doing that, but that would be part of at least the spirit of physicalism, is there's not mentality at the fundamental level.
Sweet. So before we get into arguments for and against physicalism, maybe we should also canvass some varieties of non-physicalist views or anti-physicalist views. So maybe first we could say non-physicalism would just mean the denial of physicalism. Sure. But there are lots of different kinds of non-physicalism. So maybe you can survey at least a few salient options for us.
Yeah, so the most straightforward would be some kind of dualism, which says that the physical and the mental are distinct, they're ontologically distinct, neither is fully grounded in the other, and co-fundamental. So you can't reduce physical truths to mental truths, you can't reduce mental truths to physical truths. They're both kind of fundamental and primary in their own right. They're either two separate kinds of things in reality or two fundamentally distinct kinds of properties in reality.
So that's property dualism, substance dualism.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be one major set of options, and those subdivide much further depending on your views on how mental causation and so forth. Another set of options would be idealism, which kind of flips physicalism on its head. So it says mental truths are the only fundamental truths. Everything else is fully constituted by the mental truths. And so if there is a physical world, it's somehow fully constituted by patterns in mental reality. So one version of this would be like Berkeleyan idealism, that the existence of trees and chairs and cups and so forth consists in perceptions and minds. So fundamentally what there is are minds and the perceptions or other mental states in those minds, and everything else is somehow constructed or constituted out of those fundamental ingredients. So I mean, there's different versions of idealism, but they would all be united in saying that the fundamental truths are exclusively mental, and everything else is somehow constructed out of those. There are also neutral monist options, which say that neither the mental nor the physical is fundamental. There's some secret third thing, like the like neutral realities or neutral properties or neutral truths, out of which both physical and mental truths are derivative or can be constructed. Yeah, I mean that's a kind of natural four-way taxonomy. Physicalism / materialism; those are often used interchangeably. Dualism, idealism, and neutral monism. That's kind of my preferred way of carving up the space of options. Each one of those can be subdivided further.
Awesome. So let's now get into arguments against physicalism, because I believe you're not a physicalist.
I'm not a physicalist.
Okay, sweet. So maybe we'll start with many subjects arguments. So you've got a recent paper forthcoming, I think, in a volume by Jeffrey Lee and Adam Pouts, right?
That's right.
On the importance of being conscious, or the importance of consciousness.
Yeah.
So what are these arguments?
Yeah, so the general idea of the many subject argument, or there's different arguments of many subjects arguments in general, is you start with the common sense truism that there's exactly one conscious subject in your vicinity, namely you. And then you argue that if physicalism is true, there would be many conscious subjects in your vicinity with more or less the same experiences as you. That's at least the first pass. We'll see that there's ways of responding that can deliver the result that technically there's only one conscious subject in your vicinity, but they typically have a result that's almost as bad, which is that there are many beings in your vicinity that are in a state that's only trivially different from consciousness, and which arguably has the same moral significance. So yeah, basically the thought is physicalism has the absurd result that there are many conscious subjects in your vicinity with more or less the same experiences as you. Because that's absurd, we should reject physicalism.
Okay, so we've got the absurdity claim. So why think that that's absurd? Why think that there aren't many subjects within my aren't many conscious subjects within my immediate vicinity?
Yeah, so there are a few things that can be said here. One, which maybe holds the most weight for me, is just the kind of common sense Morean justification. It's just like we come to philosophy with a stock of prior opinions. David Lewis, the great David Lewis, who might be in one of these pictures back here, tells us it's not the business of philosophy to dramatically revise our pre-theoretic commonsensical opinions. Anyway, so I think there's something plausible about that methodology, and it does seem to be a pretty deep-seated core part of common sense that there's just one conscious being in my vicinity. There's not millions upon millions of numerically distinct conscious subjects with very similar experiences to mine. That's just kind of a core part of common sense. And so that's a kind of Morean justification. Another justification for that like one subject premise is that denying it leads to massive normative revisionism. So, wherever you think that you're doing something that causes pain to one conscious subject, really you're doing something that causes pain to huge numbers of conscious subjects. And, on some versions of this argument, like the numbers aren't going to be equal. So it might not be that like the number of conscious subjects associated, in my vicinity is the exact same as the number of conscious subjects in your vicinity. It might depend on like how big we are. So people who are a little bit larger for combinatoric reasons will have on these views like vastly more conscious subjects in their vicinity compared to people who are relatively smaller. And so you would arguably get the like absurd normative results that if you have the opportunity to alleviate the pain of a large person or alleviate to an equal degree the pain of a small person, these alternative views might say you should just give massive priority to larger individuals. That's going to be very counterintuitive to say the least.
And maybe not just larger individuals, but also like larger species. So like whales and
whales are going to
elephants.
Get a lot of priority.
These are going to be the real utility monsters among us, are the whales.
Yeah. You can think of this as a utility monster kind of worry. And so, fundamentally, I see this as a little bit of a Morean argument too. It's just like, well, it's something like a Morean truth or a deep-seated part of common sense morality that we should not give vast moral preference to larger individuals or larger animals, but the relevant forms of physicalism would seem to have that result. And so the views that seem to achieve the most satisfactory kind of reflective equilibrium, doing justice to our pre-theoretic normative views, would be to reject physicalism, or at least the relevant forms of physicalism, in favor of maybe some kind of dualism.
So some people object to these like ethics to metaphysics inferences, like suppose we're convinced that if there really were millions of people starving right now around the world, people in first world countries who have comparatively a lot of money should be giving up, say, 40% of their income to alleviate global poverty, to alleviate famine, all those sorts of things. Now, suppose we accept that premise is true. Well, then suppose also we say, well, of course I'm not obliged to give up 40% of my income, so there must not be millions of people starving.
Yeah.
So it's almost like I go from this pre-theoretical ethical commitment that I'm not obliged to give away 40% of my income or even more. I go from that kind of normative claim to the maybe metaphysical or empirical claim that there actually aren't millions of people starving. One might worry that you're doing the same thing here, where we go from these normative claims from ordinary common sense about preferential treatment, how we shouldn't be treating larger people differently than smaller people, and then inferring that so they must not contain many millions of more conscious beings within their immediate vicinity. It seems very similar, suspicious. So what do you make of that worry?
Yeah, so I'm sympathetic to this worry. It does pull on me a little bit. I give a similar case in the paper of maybe if your elementary school education was anything like mine, it was like a foundational part of your moral formation to think recycling is like a good thing to do. It helps the planet, it helps the environment. There are a lot of people for whom that might be a core part of their web of moral beliefs. But then you can imagine maybe some empirical research comes out that suggests, well, maybe recycling isn't so helpful for the environment or for the planet. It would be, I think, unjustified, irrational to dismiss those empirical findings on the grounds that, well, if that were right, then this core part of my moral belief would be wrong and it actually wouldn't be good to recycle. And so I can just dismiss this empirical finding. So I think it's certainly true that in a lot of cases, these ethics to metaphysics inferences are illegitimate. I would not want to draw from these cases the general lesson that it's never legitimate to reason from ethical claims to descriptive claims, or that descriptive claims should always have inferential or epistemic priority over normative claims. So I don't know of any completely uncontroversial examples where it does seem okay to reason in the other direction. But I do think this general approach of philosophy is largely a matter of achieving reflective equilibrium with respect, giving special weight to the deepest parts of common sense, both descriptive and normative. And just like reflective equilibrium, it doesn't give absolute priority of general judgments over particular case judgments, or particular case judgments given priority over general judgments. In some cases, you would adjust your judgment about general principles to fit the particular cases. In some cases, you would go in the opposite direction. I think the same is true, at least in principle, for the normative and the descriptive. There's not a general rule in doing philosophy that when there's a tension between plausible normative claims and plausible descriptive claims, you always need to adjust the normative claims. I think it can go both ways. It's partly a matter of how deep-seated the prior belief is, how foundational it is, how central it is to the web of beliefs. And so I wouldn't want to enforce a kind of like general rule that like the descriptive always has epistemic priority to the normative. But I certainly think there are a lot of cases where that's a natural thing to say.
So we've been focusing on this claim, or the premise in your argument, that there aren't many conscious subjects in my vicinity. Yeah. But there's another premise in your argument, which is saying that if physicalism is true, well, then there are many conscious subjects in my vicinity. So in the paper, you focus on conscious parts, conscious coinciders, and conscious person candidates. Yeah. So maybe you can just walk us through those three.
Good. Yeah, so the challenge of conscious parts would say, if physicalism is true, then not only you, but many of your proper parts are conscious as well. So these might include your brain, they might include all of you except for one neuron in your left cerebral hemisphere. It might include, like a whole hemisphere of your brain, your cerebrum, and so maybe say a bit about that. So let's focus on a particular case. So let's take an object, we'll call it brain minus. It consists of the entirety of your brain except for a single arbitrarily chosen neuron. Okay. Clearly, brain minus is not you. If you want to insist that brain minus is you, then just pick another neuron. Like that like your brain minus one neuron is not identical to you. But here's the argument that if physicalism is true, then brain minus is conscious. First of all, consider like an invatted brain that's almost exactly similar to your brain, physically speaking, except it's one neuron smaller. So it's almost a duplicate of your brain, but it's missing one neuron. And let's just stipulate that it is an intrinsic duplicate of brain minus. So it's an intrinsic duplicate of this large proper part of your brain, which is the entirety of your brain minus one neuron. In this invatted brain scenario, it's plausible that this duplicate of brain minus, call it brainy, it's plausible that brainy is conscious if physicalism is true. Why is that plausible? Well, it's plausible that there's something conscious going on. I mean, this is an intrinsic duplicate of a properly functioning brain that's almost exactly identical to your brain. So it's plausible that something is conscious in this scenario. If physicalism is true, the conscious subject couldn't be like an immaterial thing. So it's got to be some physical thing. In this thing, brainy looks like the best candidate. Okay, so brainy is a conscious subject. A proper part of you, brain minus, is an intrinsic duplicate, an intrinsic physical duplicate of brainy. So in intrinsic physical respects, brain minus is exactly the same as brainy. Add the premise that consciousness is an intrinsic property, therefore one that's shared among intrinsic duplicates, and it follows that that brain minus is conscious as well. Now, notice that the inference there was brain minus is an intrinsic physical duplicate of brainy. Brainy is conscious, therefore if physicalism is true, then brain minus is conscious as well. The reason we can draw that inference is both the intrinsicality of consciousness and the move from this is an intrinsic physical duplicate, therefore it's an intrinsic duplicate simplicator. Because if physicalism is true, then being an intrinsic physical duplicate is sufficient for being just a duplicate simplicator. Okay, so given those premises, intrinsicality of consciousness and the consciousness of brainy, it follows that brain minus is conscious. Rinse and repeat for any large proper part of you where an intrinsic duplicate of that thing would suffice on its own to support consciousness, and we get the result that given physicalism, there are countless conscious beings in your vicinity.
Okay, sweet. Before we go on to conscious coinciders and conscious person candidates, maybe we can just briefly touch on two potential objections to this. Okay. So one is Ted Sider has this view that consciousness is extrinsic because it's sort of got this intrinsic component, consciousness star, and this is true more generally of phenomenal properties for Ted Sider. But also it's got this extrinsic component, namely not being a proper part of some larger thing which has consciousness star. So under that view, consciousness seems to be extrinsic rather than intrinsic, and we might think also there are certain maybe representationalist views in philosophy of mind which treat consciousness as pretty extrinsic, either having to do with causal relations to the environment or representational relations to some content or something like that. So at least a number of philosophers might try to put pressure on this intrinsicality of consciousness point. I'll put that on the table, and then I'll put one other thing on the table, and then you can address them together. Another one, we might, instead of going for this maximality proposal from Ted Sider, we might opt for something like a minimality proposal. So maybe there's some sort of minimal basis for consciousness, such that no proper part of it is a basis for consciousness. And maybe what we could say is that the physicalists just identify as persons with the minimal basis for consciousness. So it's going to be some like minimal collection of neurons, let's say some sort of executive unit that like Christopher Peacock and others have talked about, or something like that. So I'm wondering what you think, firstly, about maximality proposals, representationalism for the extrinsicality side, and then how you might respond to like this minimality proposal.
Yeah, good. So with the maximality stuff, so Sider is certainly right. There are a lot of properties that are almost intrinsic, but actually once you think about it, you see they're not quite intrinsic, they're actually maximal properties. So he gives the example of being a house. Like there's a strong intrinsic component to being a house. Like you got to have a certain property, call it house star, which is like whatever it takes intrinsically for something to be a house. But also you need to not be a proper part of anything else, or at least not a large proper part of anything else that has what it takes intrinsically to be a house. So what it is to be a house is to be a house star that's not a large proper part of any other house star. And then I think that is just the correct account of being a house. I think, and maximality is everywhere. Being a chair is a maximal property, being a house, lots of properties like this table. He wants to extend that line to consciousness. So there is an intrinsic component to consciousness, call it consciousness star, which he's a physicalist, so he wants to treat this as a kind of intrinsic physical neurological property. But to be conscious is not to be conscious star. It's to be conscious star and moreover not to be a large proper part of anything else that's conscious star. What I want to say here is, I think in the paper I used the language of this is a wretched subterfuge, but like more substantively, and Trenton Merrick's makes a similar point to this in response to Ted Sider. But basically, if there is an intrinsic component to consciousness together with this extrinsic negative component, the part that matters morally is arguably the intrinsic component. So if something is intrinsically identical to a being in excruciating pain, then that thing is in a state that sucks as much as being in excruciating pain. Like the mere fact that it's part of a larger thing that's also in that intrinsic state, like that's cold comfort for this thing. It's like, well, technically, the way we use the term conscious, we wouldn't count you as conscious, we wouldn't count you as in excruciating pain. But this thing, by Sider's own admission, is intrinsically in the exact same state as something in excruciating pain. And it's only a kind of like fact about how we use words that we technically don't count it as being conscious or in excruciating pain. But I think, when it comes to like, is it in a state that's just as bad as excruciating pain? Is it in a state with the same moral significance as that? I think it's the intrinsic component that matters. And so I think this view would still have the kind of like normative revisionary consequences, even if, technically we could, we're now allowed to talk as though there's only one conscious being in your vicinity. In terms of the other kinds of phenomenal externalism, like representationalist views that say like, well, phenomenal character is fixed by representational content, and representational content is determined by extrinsic causal informational relations to features in your environment. I think, so you're right, there are views like this that deny the intrinsicality of consciousness. I don't think it matters so much for the purposes of this argument, because we can revise the argument to accommodate views like this. So just when we consider the brainy thought experiment, make brainy a like recently invatted brain. And so this brain has all the kind of causal history and evolutionary history needed to fix the content of its internal states. Then those standard forms of phenomenal externalism will say, yeah, brainy is conscious and has the same kind of phenomenal character as an ordinary human being. So then the argument would go a little bit differently, but you would just argue that like, well, brain minus is both an intrinsic duplicate and shares the relevant external historical properties as well. Therefore, it's conscious too, and off we go. So I think those forms of phenomenal externalism are not going to block the result that there are many conscious subjects in your vicinity. There was a third.
The minimality proposal?
Oh, the minimality. So I haven't given as much thought to this, but off the cuff, I think it's going to be, so maybe there is a like minimal central unit in my brain that is intrinsically sufficient for consciousness, such that if you took away even one cell or one electron, it would no longer have what it takes intrinsically to support consciousness. But if there is such a thing, well, I think I would expect that there are many such things, so there's probably not going to be a unique minimal element. And there would also be a complication having to do with, the thing that's minimally sufficient for consciousness might not be minimally sufficient for my specific rich, vivid form of consciousness. So it might be this, some simple executive unit or whatever. A duplicate of that considered on its own would have just like bare consciousness, like a very like degraded form of consciousness. Whereas, that's not the kind of consciousness that I have. And so I don't know how you would make that view work with the kind of both determinates and determinable of consciousness. Like you can't have both consciousness meet a minimality condition and the determinates of consciousness meet a minimality condition, because the minimal thing that would satisfy the intrinsic constraints on this determinate form of consciousness would not be the minimal thing that would satisfy the intrinsic constraints on consciousness as such. And so, yeah, I just don't really see how to work out a version of that view, but I haven't thought about it enough to...
Yeah, well, and it might, this view might succumb to at least the other forms of the many subjects argument, where like arguably there are many things coincident with, under physicalism, there are many things coincident with this executive unit. And moreover, arguably there are many seemingly equally good candidate executive units which just differ at the boundaries by a single free electron or something.
Yeah, and so maybe you need determinately, at least n elementary particles. Anything less than n can't support consciousness. But exactly which n elementary particles might be, you could have this n or this overlapping n.
Yeah, okay, so then let's very briefly get into the conscious person candidates and the conscious coinciders, and then I won't sort of give any pushback to those, and we'll just move on to the next argument.
Okay, good. Yeah, so the conscious coinciders argument says, if physicalism is true, then not only you, but certain things that that materially coincide with you are also conscious. So some of this is going to be dependent on your background ontology, but I'll just give one example. So, in some views, you, like even physicalist views, you are distinct from your body because you have different persistence conditions from your body. So intuitively, like at least on physicalism, if I shoot you in the head, then you will cease to exist within a few seconds at least. Whereas your body is not going to cease to exist. Your body will continue to exist as a corpse, but you won't. Okay, so on physicalism, maybe you and your body are very intimately connected, but you're not one and the same thing because you have different persistence conditions, at least arguably. Okay, but now there's an argument that, okay, let's assume you're distinct from your body. If physicalism is true, then not only you, but also your body is conscious. Why would that be? Well, the key premise here would be that consciousness is a categorical and temporally intrinsic property. I think this is just intuitively plausible. So if physicalism is true, then consciousness needs to be some physical property that's both categorical and temporally intrinsic. But then the argument from here is that you and your body, you only differ with respect to your non-categorical properties, like your modal properties, like your persistence conditions, or your temporally extrinsic properties, properties that you have in virtue of not how things are here and now, but in virtue of how things will be in the future or were in the past. So, maybe you will be slightly shorter lived than your body for the reasons I just gave. So that's a difference in your temporally extrinsic properties. You have different persistence conditions. That's a difference in your like modal or hypothetical properties. But if we accept the intuition that consciousness is categorical and temporally intrinsic, then any differences between you and your body would not be a difference with respect to consciousness, and therefore, given physicalism, not only you but also your body is conscious. That's the conscious coinciders argument. The many person candidates argument, and this is largely inspired by Peter Unger. So a person candidate is a roughly human body-shaped material thing in your vicinity, and on certain kind of abundant ontological views, there will be many overlapping person candidates in your vicinity. So many roughly human body-shaped material things that largely overlap and only differ in which electron along your periphery it includes as a part. So there's going to be trillions upon trillions of these largely overlapping person candidates. And the thought here is that if physicalism is true, there's not going to be any principled way to say there's just one material thing that's conscious. We know there's at least one material thing that's conscious if physicalism is true, because you know with Cartesian certainty that you are conscious. And arguably, given physicalism, there's nothing else for you to be but one of the person candidates. And so if there's one conscious person candidate in your vicinity, given that there's no relevant, interesting physical differences between one person candidate and another, we're forced to the conclusion that more than one person candidate, probably trillions upon trillions of person candidates, are conscious, and therefore, given physicalism, you get many subjects.
Awesome. Okay, that's the many subjects argument. Let's move on to, you've got a forthcoming Philosophia article, right, on sensory awareness arguments for dualism, right? Unfortunately, I haven't read this one yet, but maybe you can at least briefly characterize the way you argue for dualism in this paper.
Yeah, so this paper is actually a commentary for an Author Meets Critics Symposium on a recent excellent book by Neil Mehta called A Pluralist Theory of Perception. But basically, the gist of the argument is, given Neil Mehta's commitments, he should be a dualist. And I also argue that these are just plausible commitments for anyone, so these are reasons for anyone to be a dualist. And the three arguments are somewhat independent of one another. Maybe I'll just focus on one that's the easiest to explain quickly. So there are kind of two or three key ideas in this argument. So the first is there's a necessary connection between certain sensory phenomenal properties and certain intentional properties. So, for example, consider your total phenomenology as you look at a red ball.
The way things feel from the inside, the first-person perspective.
The total what it's like of your conscious state as you look at a red ball in good lighting. I think it's very plausible that that phenomenal state entails that you have certain intentional properties. Namely, it seems to you as though there's a red round thing in front of you. You are in a state that has certain veridicality conditions. It's true or accurate or veridical only if there's something red and round in front of you. You are aware of certain sensory qualities like redness and roundness. So there seems to be a kind of necessary connection between certain phenomenal properties on the one hand and certain intentional properties like being aware of or representing or seeming to you as though there's something red and round in front of you. That's the first claim. And a lot of people in the kind of broadly representationalist, intentionalist tradition are on board with a claim like this. I think it has a lot of surface plausibility to it. The second key claim of this argument is that consciousness, phenomenal properties, the properties characterizing what it's like to be a subject at a given time, are temporally intrinsic. And I've used this term before, but just to redefine it. So the basic thought here is they're properties that don't constitutively depend on what happened at other times. Like what it's like to be you now, of course, it may causally depend on what happened in the past, but it doesn't constitutively depend on what happened to your ancestors millions of years ago. It's a kind of like fully here, right here and now. So maybe just some examples to get the contrast. So intuitively, roundness is a temporally intrinsic property. If something is round, that's wholly a matter of what it's like here and now. It's not even partly dependent on what things were like in the past, except perhaps causally. Whereas, being a widow, that's a property that constitutively depends on what happened in the past. Or wearing a shirt that once belonged to a lumberjack, that's a property that you might have the property now, but partly in virtue of things that happened in the past. So the intuition, which I think a lot of people just admit the initial intuitive pull of this, is that consciousness is like roundness. It is not like wearing a shirt that once belonged to a lumberjack. It doesn't constitutively depend on what happened in the distant past. Okay, so these two claims together, which I think most people find like initially plausible, what I want to argue is you can't have both given physicalism. And the rough idea here is, okay, so suppose phenomenal properties entail certain intentional properties, like representing the presence of a red round thing. Now we ask, like, what is that intentional property given physicalism? Well, the most well-developed, plausible physicalist accounts of these intentional properties tend to make them temporally extrinsic. They tend to make intentional properties constitutively dependent on what happened in the distant past. So one straightforward version of this would be like the teleosemantic tradition, where what is it to represent that there's a red and round thing in front of you? It's to be in a state that has the function of indicating the presence of a red and round thing. Okay, but what gives a state the function that it has? Well, a common view would be a kind of selectional story. It's something about like my visual system was selected for such and such purposes in order to carry this information. So you're gonna cite facts about the distant past in my evolutionary history, or maybe parallel processes within my own individual development and learning process. But it's not going to be a here and now thing. It's not going to be a fully temporally intrinsic thing. Okay, so given that the best reductive physicalist accounts of intentionality are going to make intentional properties temporally extrinsic, and given that phenomenal properties intuitively are temporally intrinsic and entail intentional properties, basically the thing that's going to have to go is physicalism. If you accept the temporal intrinsicality of phenomenal properties and the intuitive claim that certain phenomenal properties entail certain intentional properties, looks like physicalism is going to have to go. Unless you can come up with some physicalist story of how it is that a brain state, a physical state of me could represent the presence of a red and round thing, and tell that story in a way that does not make it temporally extrinsic.
Interesting. Okay. Well, there are a lot of dialectical avenues to pursue there, but for the sake of covering more arguments, let's move on to conceivability arguments.
Yeah.
So there are different kinds of conceivability arguments. Some of them focus on conceiving of like a physical duplicate of me which lacks phenomenal consciousness. That's maybe like a zombie type physical conceivability argument. There are conceivability arguments that focus maybe in the other direction, where it's like we can conceive of a ghost in the absence of physical properties in a physical world. So maybe you could just take us through like what are conceivability arguments, how do they work, maybe some of the range of conceivability arguments.
Yeah, good. So conceivability arguments are usually going to start with a conceivability premise to the effect that a certain scenario is conceivable, meaning, well, it can mean different things, but roughly we can kind of positively imagine it or form a kind of coherent, distinct positive conception of the scenario in question. And then there's usually a move where we infer from conceivability to possibility. So, in the case of zombies, I can conceive of something that's physically just like a conscious human being, but which lacks consciousness. That's the conceivability premise. And then the second premise would be, well, if that's conceivable, then it's possible. And then from there, well, if it's possible for there to be zombies, then it's a pretty straightforward jump to the conclusion that physicalism is false. Why? Because physicalism, whatever else, however it's defined, it should at least entail that all positive properties are, metaphysically necessitated by my physical properties. So so if it's possible to have all my physical properties without consciousness, then it looks like we have a counterexample to physicalism. So that's the zombie version. There's also spectrum inversion versions where I can, maybe conceive of something that's physically identical to you, but with inverted color qualia. So where you have phenomenally reddish experiences, your inverted twin has phenomenally greenish experiences. That would also, if that scenario is possible, that would also refute physicalism for the same reason, because you have a certain experience, a phenomenally reddish experience that is not shared by your physical duplicate, and so it follows that you have some positive property that's not entailed by your total set of physical properties. Ghost arguments, it's a little bit less straightforward to draw the anti-physicalist conclusion, but yeah, the way these would normally go is, okay, we can conceive of a ghost. What's a ghost? It's kind of the mirror image of a zombie. So a zombie has all your physical properties but lacks your phenomenal properties. A ghost has all your phenomenal properties but lacks your physical properties. So conceivability claim is that's a coherently conceivable situation. Why think that? Why think that we can conceive of something that has all my phenomenal properties but lacks any of my physical properties, like my size and shape and mass. Well, one reason to think that is, get in the grip of some kind of like Cartesian evil demon skeptical scenario. So when you're entertaining the evil demon hypothesis, you're entertaining a scenario in which like you have all your intrinsic conscious states, all your current thoughts, but you don't have a body. There's no material world at all. Okay, so what are you imagining yourself to be in that scenario? A ghost.
Yeah, well, and importantly, just to briefly interrupt, like when students come across this, like at least in my experience, very rarely they're like, I don't even understand what this thought experiment, like they usually think it's weird and like, this is so implausible. Like this is silly, but they're not baffled at like, what did you just say? Like they understand what's going on.
Yeah,
like they understand the scenario.
Yeah, I think that this is a strong reason to accept the conceivability of ghosts. It's like, this seems like a coherently conceivable scenario. Maybe it's weird. Maybe we have no reason to take it seriously as a hypothesis for how the actual world is. But it's clearly different from saying like, okay, imagine you are a round square. Like where it's like, that's not a coherent way for things to be. I can't conceive of that. Like, no, this is a perfectly coherent way for things to be. And one I think symptom of this is, a lot of us have the view, I think I have this view that like, yeah, these scenarios, we shouldn't have high credence in them, but they're the kinds of scenarios we can't rule out with absolute certainty. Well, why not? Because they're a priori coherent scenarios. If they weren't, then we should be able to rule them out with certainty, at least upon idealized reasoning. Okay, so I think there's reason to accept the conceivability of ghosts. Again, if we accept some kind of inference from conceivability to possibility, we'll get the possibility of ghosts. Now, does that give us the falsity of physicalism? Not totally straightforwardly. So in the case of zombies, it was a straightforward inference from the possibility of zombies to the falsity of physicalism, just because physicalism, everyone kind of agrees that entails that the physical truths should entail all positive truths. And so if I can find one positive truth, like that there's a conscious being that's not entailed by the totality of physical truths, that's a counterexample to physicalism. You can't reason quite in that way from the possibility of ghosts to the actual falsity of physicalism. But I do think the possibility of ghosts is probably sufficient to rule out some specific forms of physicalism. So that I see as the main value of ghost-based conceivability arguments. So for example, suppose you're like a type identity theorist. You think, what it is to be in pain is to have firing C fibers. You think those properties are identical. The property of being in phenomenal pain is numerically identical to the property of having firing C fibers. Well, if ghosts are possible, then that refutes that particular form of physicalism. Why? Because my ghost duplicate feels pain, but doesn't have any size, shape, collection of neurons, doesn't have the physical properties you'd need in order to have firing C fibers. So therefore, we have a kind of Leibniz's law argument against that. That having firing C fibers can't be identical to pain because it's possible to have pain without having firing C fibers. So I think maybe more importantly, behaviorist and functionalist forms of identity physicalism would also be ruled out. So suppose you say what it is to be in pain, that the property of being in pain is identical to the property of being in some state or other that is normally caused by bodily damage and normally causes such and such bodily behavior. So that would be a crude form of functionalism, which is a popular form of physicalism. Well, if ghosts are possible, that can't be right, because the ghost counterpart of me has pain but doesn't have a body, and so does not have any state that is poised to cause relevant bodily behavior, does not have any state that is normally or typically caused by bodily damage. And so I think ghost-based conceivability arguments can be powerful in ruling out a lot of specific forms of physicalism that many people want to accept, but it doesn't straightforwardly rule out physicalism as such.
So there are a few ways to respond to these conceivability arguments. 3 immediately come to mind. One is to say that zombies, ghosts, etc. aren't conceivable. So maybe that's like an a priori physicalist response. Another way to respond is to say that they are conceivable, but they're just not ultimately metaphysically possible. They still really couldn't obtain in reality. So that's what we could call an a posteriori physicalist response. And then a third response. This one is extremely unpopular, so maybe let's not go into it in much depth, but I at least just want to lay it out there for the audience, is to say, no, they are possible, but we can have a physicalism where the physical facts don't metaphysically necessitate the phenomenal facts, because maybe grounding is like indeterministic or something like that. Alex Moran gave a presentation here actually about that. So we're not going to go into grounding indeterminism and whatnot. That's a very unpopular physicalist view. Usually physicalists want to say that the physical facts settle the phenomenal facts. Maybe they just are physical facts. That you wouldn't be able to have that because identity is clearly a necessary relation. So we'll set that response aside. And we'll also temporarily set aside the a priori physicalist response, because we kind of gave some responses to that. And when I had Brian on my channel a few months back to talk about psychophysical harmony, we talked about a priori physicalism in much more detail. So what do you make of the a posteriori physicalist response?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think it's the strongest response of the three, of the available responses. My sense is it's now the most popular move among physicalists for resisting this argument and other related arguments like the knowledge argument. I do think it comes with some prima facie cost. So, basically the cost is a kind of special pleading cost. Like, most people agree that there are some counterexamples to the principle that conceivability entails possibility. There's a set of counterexamples that basically are inspired by Kripke's naming and necessity. So the negations of Kripkean a posteriori necessities tend to be counterexamples to the principle that conceivability in every case entails possibility.
Yeah, just to give a few examples, like water is H2O, lightning is electric discharge, heat is mean molecular kinetic energy. These seem to be things that substantive empirical discoveries, but they seem to be like necessary truths about the nature of water and the nature of lightning and things like that.
Yeah, it seems like you can conceive of finding out that water is not H2O, but standard Kripkean orthodoxy says it's nonetheless not possible for water to not be H2O. Okay, so these are kind of generally accepted counterexamples to the idea that conceivability entails possibility. But as Kripke himself noted, they're not really of the right form that would be relevant to the zombie argument or other related epistemic arguments. And there are a lot of technical ways to make that point precise, but maybe the least technical way to put it is that all of the uncontroversial counterexamples to this principle that conceivability entails possibility, they all involve like twin earthable expressions. So like water would be the paradigmatic case where you've got some expression where like you and your counterpart on twin earth might use the term to refer to different entities, where your counterpart, your twin for the purposes of twin earth thought experiments, what matters is that you're kind of like narrow functional duplicates and phenomenal duplicates. Due to extrinsic facts, you use the term to pick out something different.
Because on twin Earth, there's XYZ, which fills lakes and streams and rivers and oceans and whatnot and falls from the sky instead of H2O, but otherwise exactly the same in physical functional respects.
Yeah, good. So I think what the correct lesson from Kripke is not, we should just throw out any inference from conceivability to possibility. The correct lesson is, well, we need to restrict the principle. We need to qualify it in the right way. So it's roughly something like, if S is conceivable and S doesn't include any twin earthable expressions, then S is possible. And there's different ways of proposing views along these lines, some of which invoke like epistemic two-dimensional semantics, which I don't really want to go into here. But suffice to say that like when you appropriately qualify or restrict these principles to deal with the Kripkean cases, they still will license the inferences from conceivability to possibility in the case of zombie arguments or invert arguments or ghost arguments. And so basically, if you want to make this a posteriori physicalist move, you need to say that there are counterexamples to this principle that are fundamentally different in kind from other uncontroversial counterexamples. Now, maybe that's not a huge cost. I mean, there's maybe our phenomenal concepts are importantly different from any other set of concepts. And so the kind of inferential principles that hold for any other set of concepts maybe don't hold for our phenomenal concepts. So maybe it's not the hugest cost in the world, but it is a kind of special pleading cost. You're saying that the principles that tend to hold with exceptionless generality elsewhere don't hold when we're talking about consciousness. So for me, like if these epistemic arguments, like the conceivability argument, were like the only reasons for rejecting physicalism, I would think like, well, okay, you got to bite some bullets and accept some otherwise ad hoc looking principles about reasoning from conceivability to possibility. But the cost of dualism, they also have bullets that they need to bite. It would not seem like a clear-cut win for dualism. For me, the reason I'm sympathetic to kind of dualist views, or at least the rejection of physicalism, is the kind of convergent lines of support. It's not just these epistemic arguments. It's a range of different considerations that all seem to converge on it. And so the costs kind of seem to pile up. But I certainly agree, like, I don't have any knockdown objections to the a posteriori physicalist response. It just seems a bit ad hoc. You're denying principles that don't seem to have any exceptions outside of the phenomenal domain.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that I've seen some people make in connection with these kind of Kripkean a posteriori necessity type counterexamples is that they all seem to involve some sort of like surface appearance properties and then an underlying nature properties. And like we can conceive of the surface appearance properties being associated with different kind of underlying nature properties. But like in those cases, the surface appearance properties are still distinct from the underlying nature properties. And when we turn to consciousness, like the way things appear just is the reality. There's no distinction there between like the way things appear, phenomenally, and then some sort of like underlying reality.
Yeah, and I think this is, so like once you understand the source of the modal illusion in the case of the Kripkean cases, you see that kind of story is just not going to apply. Like if it is a modal illusion that zombies are possible, the source of it is not going to be the Kripkean story. It's going to be a fundamentally different kind of modal illusion that we don't really seem to have precedent for in other cases.
Yeah, and by modal illusion, you just mean some case where it seems conceivable, but it's not.
Or where it seems possible, but it's
seems
not.
Possible. Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned, well, let's stick with arguments against physicalism because I just, the audience is familiar with the interaction problem and all these other sorts of things. So let's just go through these. I want to get these on the audience's radar. You also have a paper on inconceivability arguments. Yeah. So what are these arguments?
Yeah, good. So the inconceivability argument, I see it as, well, it's a relative of the conceivability argument, but it kind of flips things around. So it says it's inconceivable for any set of physical truths to fully ground a phenomenal truth. So it's inconceivable for facts about the motions and mechanical interactions of insentient particles to constitute or ground an experience of vivid pink or a sharp stinging pain. And then where the conceivability argument says that conceivability is a guide to possibility, the inconceivability argument says that inconceivability is a guide to falsity. You could also say impossibility, but that's stronger than we need. So the thought is, well, if it's inconceivable that purely physical truths constitute an experience of pink, then that's reason to think that purely physical truths don't constitute an experience of pink, and therefore physicalism is false about experiences of pink or other phenomenal states as well. So the gist of that paper is to suggest that the premises of this argument are well motivated in their own right. This is a weighty argument, but more significantly, it's in some ways a stronger argument than conceivability arguments. Basically, what I argue is anyone who accepts the premises of the conceivability argument will have to accept the premises of the inconceivability argument, but the converse doesn't hold. You could perfectly well accept the premises of the inconceivability argument without accepting the premises of the conceivability argument. And in particular, you could reject, in the case of the conceivability argument, you could reject the inference from conceivability to possibility by adopting some kind of off-the-shelf phenomenal concept strategy. But the standard phenomenal concept strategies are just not going to help in responding to the inconceivability argument.
What worries you most about this argument? Like, if you were a physicalist, how would you get out of it?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's two main premises, so there's two main options for
Yes.
for how to get out of it. I think denying the inconceivability premise is hard for me to get a handle on. I mean, I just, I can see how, the movements of a bunch of individual particles could constitute a person running, or how the movements of a bunch of individual animals could constitute a stampede. I can't get a conceptual handle on like what it would be for the movements of a bunch of individual particles to constitute a phenomenal presentation of red. There seems to be enough of a disconnect there that I guess I wouldn't want to reject the inconceivability premise. So probably the right way to go would be to, or the most promising response would be to reject the idea that inconceivability is a guide to falsity or to impossibility. So I think that's probably what I would reject if I wanted to hold on to physicalism. It does strike me that that's a more costly move than denying the corresponding inference from conceivability to possibility. I mean, if you say like, oh, this thing is conceivable, but really given the nature of things, it's not possible, that doesn't seem so obviously bad on its face. But to admit that like conceivabilism or physicalism is making a claim about the world that is literally inconceivable. Like even an idealized mind can't get a positive handle on what it would be for the motions of individual particles to constitute a phenomenal presentation of pink. Then you're positing something, you're positing an aspect of reality that's kind of closed off to all possible minds to get a kind of positive handle on what that situation would amount to. And that's a fundamentally different kind of thing than just like standard a posteriori physicalists are on the hook for doing already. I mean, the motivating idea here is a kind of background thought that like reality is somehow thoroughly intelligible. There's no aspect or feature or fact about reality that escapes the net of all possible minds. There's an interesting question like, well, you don't need a claim quite that strong. I am attracted to a claim that's that strong, but it is, I do think it's an attractive claim, and it does just directly motivate the inference.
Let's go on to the knowledge argument. It's very similar to conceivability arguments in certain ways, but maybe you can at least briefly articulate it and your take on it.
Yeah. So most famous version of the knowledge argument, well, C.D. Broad really came up with the earlier version of it, but people usually cite Frank Jackson, and Jackson gives two versions of it, but people mention his Mary thought experiment. So Mary is a very famous character. So Mary is a super scientist raised in a black and white room, never experienced color outside the grayscale in her life, but in her black and white room learns all the physical facts about human color vision, so knows all about the different wavelengths of light that objects reflect and absorb based on their like intrinsic atomic microstructure, knows how different wavelengths of light affect the retinal cells in your eyes, the optic nerve, the visual cortex, behavior, and so on. So everything physical there is to know about color vision, Mary knows through black and white textbooks and black and white lectures in her room. But intuitively, she doesn't know what it's like to see red. And we're supposed to think that because intuitively, when she leaves the room and sees a ripe tomato in the garden for the first time, she's going to say something like, wow, I never knew that this is what it's like to see red. So intuitively, she learns something new when she leaves the room. But if she learned something new, that means there must be some fact about human color vision that she didn't know already, but she knew all the physical facts about human color vision. Ergo, there are more facts than that, so physicalism is false. What do I think of this argument? I mean, I think it's I think it's a sound argument, at least if you're careful to lay it out. I think it's pretty. The premises are pretty compelling. I do think it's very closely parallel to the zombie arguments or the other conceivability arguments, just in that the standard moves for resisting the premises in the conceivability arguments, they have very close counterparts in the Mary argument. And so I don't know if it adds anything to the conceivability argument.
Well, maybe I can just ask you if you can briefly touch on maybe two different responses to it.
Okay.
So like one is like the phenomenal concept strategy. So if you can at least explain what that is and then your take on it. And then the second one would be, I think David Lewis took this line where like Mary just gets a new ability. Like she's able to now identify red things, and she gains like know-how, or instead of knowledge instead of propositional knowledge. Yeah. So maybe what do you take of those? Yeah, make of those.
Good. So maybe I'll take the ability hypothesis first. So yeah, the thought is, well, maybe we can distinguish between knowledge that such and such is the case versus knowledge how to do something. On one view, which I think Lewis is sympathetic to, knowing how to do something is just a matter of having an ability. And so Lewis's thought is, okay, Mary doesn't gain any knowledge that. She doesn't learn a new fact. She gains new knowledge how, so she gains a new ability. And so there's no like information about the world that she didn't know at the earlier time, but then learns once she sees red. Okay, what's the ability she acquires or learns? Something like, well, the ability to imagine red things. Maybe she didn't have that before. The ability to recognize red things by sight, maybe re-identify based on experience. So there's this set of abilities that she has at the later time that she didn't have, so she gains new knowledge how, not new knowledge that. I think this is the least plausible of the main responses to the Mary argument. Maybe I'll give a few reasons. So one, it just seems intuitively plausible that she gains some new information about the qualia you experience when you see color. So the ability hypothesis just doesn't do justice to that intuition that there's some new information or some gaining of knowledge that. And I think you can support this by just thinking about variations on the case. So, maybe before we let Mary out into the world, we show her two patches of color, one red, one green, but we don't say which one's red or which one's green. We just say, we show her the red and we say, like, let this be an A-type experience. And then we show her the green and we say, let this be a B-type experience. And then you ask her, like, hey, when people look at tomatoes, do they have an A-type experience or a B-type experience? Okay, intuitively, she doesn't know at this point. Then she goes out in the garden and she sees the tomato and she realizes it's an A-type experience. Okay, so now she can express her new knowledge in terms of knowledge that. Like, oh, I never knew that people looking at tomatoes had A-type experiences. Now I know that tomatoes induce A-type experiences. So I think one reason why the ability hypothesis might seem superficially plausible is that when you imagine her expressing her new knowledge, she doesn't use a knowledge that construction. She's like, oh, I never knew what it was like.
Yeah, that's what it's like.
Or that's what it's like. But like, there's this demonstrative element. It's like, is there actually any, like, can you say in other terms? But when you put it in terms of like, no, you first give her the concepts of the reddish and the greenish experience, but non-tendentiously, so she doesn't know which color goes with which. Then it becomes much more natural for her to express in knowledge that constructions her new knowledge. Another argument, I think David Papineau gives this argument, maybe he got it from someone else, against the ability hypothesis is you can imagine a case where someone just lacks the ability to imagine anything. So maybe they have like aphantasia or whatever. And so Mary gets the new experience and doesn't gain the ability to imagine redness. But now think of Mary like while she's looking at red. So not a moment later, because then she won't be able to imagine it, and maybe there'll be memory issues. But like while she's looking at red, intuitively, at that moment she knows what it's like to see red, but she doesn't have the ability to imagine. And maybe she's going to forget, so she doesn't have the ability to like recognize red things by sight. And so you can, like, in that moment, while she's experiencing red and introspecting on her experience, intuitively she knows what it's like to see red, but she doesn't gain any of the abilities that Lewis says she gains, at least in this stipulated scenario. And so that's another reason to think that merely gaining abilities doesn't capture all there is to knowing what it's like to see red. Phenomenal concept strategy, I think this is a better approach. This basically says, like, okay, Mary doesn't learn So suppose physicalism we understand is the view that, well, all facts are physical facts. Then we'd say, well, if Mary gained knowledge of a new fact that she didn't know before, that would refute physicalism because she knew all the physical facts. But instead we can say, no, she learned an old fact under a new mode of presentation, a new set of concepts. So it would be a bit like, I already knew that Samuel Clemens is my neighbor, but then I learned that Mark Twain is my neighbor, and I didn't know that. But Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, those are two concepts or two names for the same thing. So arguably, the fact that Clemens is my neighbor is identical to the fact that Mark Twain is my neighbor. But you intuitively you can know it under one mode of presentation without knowing it under another mode of presentation. So similarly, the fact that seeing red is like this is identical to the fact that seeing red has such and such physical property, but we have different terms or different concepts for those two properties, so it's an old fact under a new mode of presentation. I think the main problem with this, it's a bit like the special pleading problem with the a posteriori physicalist response to the conceivability argument, which is that this doesn't behave in the way that learning old facts under new modes of presentation typically behave. So typically, if you knew all the facts or all the physical facts, you wouldn't be able. You would already know the connecting facts to know that Mark Twain is Samuel Clemens. So if you knew all the background facts about which individual both lives next to you and wrote all these books, you would already know the connecting fact that, the thing that satisfies the mode of presentation for Mark Twain is the thing that satisfies the mode of presentation for Samuel Clemens. And so you would already be able to figure out, if you knew all those facts, that Mark Twain is Samuel Clemens, and therefore Mark Twain is your neighbor. So if phenomenal concepts and physical concepts were just two different modes of presentation for the same properties, well, if it behaved at all like other cases, then complete knowledge of the physical facts would already tell you that, the thing that satisfies this mode of presentation is one and the same as the thing that satisfies that mode of presentation. And so it wouldn't be news to you that they go together in this particular case.
Do you think that's the best approach of the physicalist to this argument, or what do you think is the best approach?
Well, I think the best response is probably, you use the phenomenal concept strategy. You say it's an old fact under a new mode of presentation, and you say that the mode of presentation kind of doesn't carry descriptive information. It's not like other modes of presentation where it's like the thing that satisfies such and such condition. So it's kind of like there's no descriptive content to it. It just kind of primitively picks out a certain physical property, but not by way of any kind of satisfying a descriptive condition. I think something like that is a standard move for the phenomenal concept strategy. I think it's probably the best bet for the physicalist who wants to respond to these arguments. It just makes phenomenal concepts kind of like their own separate thing. I mean, that's what gives it the feel of an ad hoc response. We say that what the rules that phenomenal concepts follow are fundamentally different from the rules of other concepts. And so there's a kind of epistemic gap here that's fundamentally distinct from epistemic gaps we find anywhere else.
Speaking of gaps, there are explanatory gap arguments. So explaining intentionality or explaining the qualitative felt character of conscious experience.
Yeah.
Maybe you can walk us through these arguments.
Yeah, I think these are very much in the same family
they're very
as
similar.
Conceivability or Mary arguments. But basically, the structure of these would be that there's an explanatory gap between any set of physical truths on the one hand and phenomenal truths on the other. And then there will be a premise to the effect that if physicalism were true, then there shouldn't be an explanatory gap between these things because the physicalism should suffice for all the truths, and so there's a background assumption here that if the physical truths necessitate or fully constitute the phenomenal truths, then there should be some kind of intelligible connection between the physical truths and the phenomenal truths, such that you can kind of see why, given the physical truths, you should get the phenomenal truths. And so the fact that there isn't any kind of intelligible connection, there's an explanatory gap between the physical truths and the phenomenal truths, we should conclude that physicalism is false. So typically there is a kind of, I mean, there's different ways of cashing it out, but there's a sense that there's an intelligible connection between kind of low-level physical facts and higher-level physical facts. Like, you tell me what all the individual cars are doing, and you tell me that there's a traffic jam going on, and it kind of seems like there's you see the intelligible connection. Yes, given that this car is slowing down and that car is slowing down and this car is doing that, I see why there must be a traffic jam arising as a kind of higher level description of all that's going on. That kind of intelligible connection that holds between car behavior and traffic jams, that holds between animal behavior and stampedes, that just doesn't seem to hold between neural activation and, experience of red, or neural activation and thoughts.
Yeah, just tell me as much information as you want about the positions of the atoms in my brain and like the hertz at which they're firing and like the sodium and potassium moving across the channels and the axons and whatnot. I'm just still left baffled why that there's this like rich technicolor phenomenology, this felt aspect of experience to it all. It's just astonishing. I don't know, to me.
Yeah, I mean, but the reason I see this is, I think this is not really interestingly different from, say, the knowledge argument. I think it's kind of just a way of getting at the same set of intuitions. Is, usually when people try to make these arguments precise, they give some kind of condition on explanatory adequacy, or what it takes for there not to be an explanatory gap between the A facts and the B facts. And one line, so this is like what David Chalmers says in The Conscious Mind, is there's got to be some kind of like a priori entailment. Like the A facts need to a priori entail the B facts. That's a necessary condition for the A facts to reductively explain the B facts. But now this looks a lot like the kind of inferential failure in the knowledge argument, because Mary is stipulated to not just know all the physical facts, but to have idealized powers of a priori reasoning. So Mary knows what all the particles are doing and can a priori deduce all the a priori entailments from those facts. She still doesn't know the phenomenal truths. But now this looks a bit like saying, like, okay, the physical truths don't explain the phenomenal truths, at least not in a reductive way, because they fail an a priori entailment condition. And so, anyway, I don't think it's a bad argument, but I think it's probably not interestingly different. So if you want to be a kind of give the like phenomenal concept response to the knowledge argument, you probably want to just reject the corresponding condition on explanatory adequacy. You say, like, no, the A facts can perfectly well explain the B facts without a priori entailing. Maybe we just posit kind of epistemically primitive bridge laws. That's good enough for explanation. I guess the other move would be to say, like, okay, maybe the physical truths don't explain the phenomenal truths, but at least in that sense of explanation, that's not a requirement for physicalism to be true. All that's required is not that there's an intelligible connection or that there's an explanatory connection, but just that there is like the right kind of metaphysical connection, which is grounding or necessitation or whatever.
What about arguments from personal identity? So at least some people have argued, I think Thomas Bogardus argues this, a number of others have argued it, that like something like substance dualism is the best way to account for various commonsensical features of personal identity. For instance, that I'm the same person as when I look at a picture of me when I'm 3 years old. Yeah, that's me when I was there. Or same with when I'm much, much older. I think Bogardus argues that like it's very difficult to find like physicalistically acceptable accounts which deliver the relevant commonsensical verdicts about personal identity. So what do you make of these arguments? If you want to spell them out a little bit further,
Yeah, good. So Swinburne has, I think, the best known versions of these arguments, but the version I like the best that I've seen is from Michael Huemer in his book, I think, Knowledge, Reality, and Value. It's like an intro philosophy text. Where
I highly recommend that to everyone. Just pick up that book.
It's a good book, and it's a good chapter. It's just like a very clear, succinct statement of what I take to be the core argument for substance dualism from personal identity. And basically the thought is there's certain very plausible claims we want to make about personal identity that you can only make if you believe in souls as like the basis for your personal identity over time. So what are these claims? So and like one important one is going to be, facts about identity over time are like determinate, substantive, not conventional facts. They're not simply to be settled by like linguistic conventions or stipulations. So the contrast here is, Derek Parfit has cases of like the identity of a club over time. So maybe you've got like, a David Lewis reading group here at Princeton, and then you can imagine various things that might happen. Maybe like 60% of the members go off and do this, and 40% go off and do that. And the larger group, they end up expanding their readings beyond David Lewis, and the smaller group is doing something slightly more faithful to the original intention. Which one is numerically identical to the original group? Kind of seems like not a substantive question. It's like something that can be settled by linguistic convention or stipulation, or maybe there's no fact of the matter. Whereas intuitively, and Parfit makes this case that he at least accepts, there's a strong intuition that facts about personal identity over time are determinate, substantive, not merely a matter of convention, not merely a matter of choice about how we use words, like whether some future person will be me. And Parfit,
because we might think like otherwise, you, as it were, could sort of get out of punishment, or get out of being justifiably punished by convincing everyone else to just like change our practices about how we refer to you or how we treat you or something like that.
So like one case,
how we view you.
One case that might be like closer to the edge is like, we invent teletransporters, and then you make a teletransporter copy of me, and the view Parfit ends up with basically is, well, it's roughly like, in some of these cases, it's just a matter of like convention or it's verbal stipulation whether to count it as you or not. But yeah, that looks kind of weird. It's like, okay, like the pre-teletransporter, I committed some heinous act, and now here, or the counterpart of me did, and now here I am, I just walked out of the teletransporter. Maybe I can like change the linguistic conventions around personal identity talk to avoid punishment. Like, that doesn't seem right. Like, either I deserve it or not, or either I owe you the $5 or I don't. It's not something to be settled by verbal stipulation. And I said humor gives a version of this argument. In a way, I think Parfit does at least as good a job, but Parfit doesn't go in for the substance dualist conclusion. Parfit argues like something like substance dualism would have to be true in order for questions of personal identity over time to be determinate and substantive. But since he thinks independently, of course, there's not souls, we're not like separately existing Cartesian egos, therefore he accepts the conclusion that he regards as counterintuitive, that actually some of these questions about identity over time, they're not substantive, they don't have determinate answers, and they aren't like normatively significant in the way we ordinarily think they do. Humor just kind of flips that around and says like, well, of course they're determinate, of course they're not settled by convention, but the only way that could be true is if they're souls. And so, one reason, suppose you want to not be a dualist and ground personal identity over time in like psychological connections. So like if there's enough psychological continuity between me as I am now and some future person, then that makes for personal identity. Well, that version's going to have problems because it's not going to make identity a one-to-one relation the way it obviously is. So because I could go in the teletransporter, create two copies. Now I'm psychologically continuous with two distinct persons, but two distinct persons can't be numerically identical to the same person. Okay, so we take it as a constraint, like any theory of personal identity should deliver the result that like identity is a one-to-one relation rather than a many-one relation. That's a constraint. Okay, you can change the psychological continuity theory to say maybe you need to be the only being at that time that's psychologically continuous with the earlier person. So there's like a no branching condition. That's going to violate another plausible constraint on personal identity, which is that identity is like an intrinsic fact. Like facts about who I am shouldn't constitutively depend on whether another copy was made somewhere else. Okay, so basically, Humer's argument is like you write down these like very attractive constraints on a theory of personal identity. That facts about personal identity are determinate and non-conventional. facts about personal identity conform to the one-one condition, that identity is a one-to-one relation, not a many-to-one relation. Identity is intrinsic. It doesn't depend on what's going on elsewhere. And I think there's just like a very plausible argument that like souls and only souls are how you satisfy those constraints. Now, you could respond by saying, well, maybe this or that constraint is negotiable, and that's what Parfit does. That's a kind of standard physicalist move. It's like, well, maybe we can negotiate on this intuition that there are determinate facts about personal identity over time, or that they're non-conventional, or that they're morally significant, or that they're many to one. Those are all moves, but I think Humer is definitely right that there are a set of just very powerful intuitions about personal identity that no view other than a soul-based theory of personal identity can accommodate. So I think that's at least a reason for accepting something like substance dualism.
So maybe one or two more arguments against physicalism, and then maybe we'll hear the best, in your view, argument against dualism, and then we'll close out. Cool. So another argument against physicalism is, I know Dustin Crummett likes this one as an argument for dualism, substance dualism specifically, is like an argument for Mereological nihilism. Yeah. So Mereological nihilism is the view that there are no composite objects. There are only simples which are arranged in various ways. So simples arranged chair-wise, or simples arranged human-wise, where simples are these non-composite, like fundamental itty-bitty objects. And there are lots of actually surprisingly compelling arguments for Mereological nihilism. Now, I actually think that a lot of these serve as basically arguments for the disjunction of nihilism and universalism, where universalism is the view that any plurality of objects composes a further object. But these arguments are based on arbitrariness considerations. So like if we think that there are, for instance, islands, why not think that there are in-cars, where like an in-car is a car-like object, a car-shaped object, which exists provided that a car is in a garage, and the in-car gets smaller and smaller and smaller as cars exit the garage, and then ceases to exist when the car leaves the garage. The persistence conditions in the specification for in-cars are extremely similar to those for islands. Islands, as the water rises around them, as the environment changes, they get smaller and smaller until when they're submerged, they cease to exist. Yeah. So arbitrariness considerations should leave us to think like, if there are islands, then there are in-cars. And we might say, well, clearly there are no in-cars, so then there are no islands. And you can run this argument for various other things. We talked earlier about like the problem of the many from Peter Unger. That motivates Mereological nihilism. We might think Mereological nihilism is motivated by the thought that like chairs and baseballs and other things like that, they really don't do any like explanatory heavy lifting in our ontology that isn't already done by the relevant simples in their arrangement. And so then, in accordance with Occam's razor, we should just shave them off. They're just explanatorily dispensable. There are so many different arguments like this. Sorites series, all different kinds of arguments for Mereological nihilism. And if we go in for that there are no composite objects, well, what about me? I seem to exist. Yeah. And so I can't be a composite object like a brain, because there are no composite objects. I can't be a brain. I can't be a human being. What could I be? Well, I could either be a physical simple. So I'm just like I think, was this like Chisolmi flirted with this at some point, where I'd like that? There's just some simple particle. Yeah, some simple particle somewhere in my brain that I'm just that physical particle. That doesn't seem very plausible.
If that leaves through like digestion or whatever, right. So, what happens?
Yeah, exactly. Or I could just be a non-physical simple. In other words, a soul, a non-physical simple, which is me and which is conscious. So what do you make of this argument?
Yeah, good. I'm undecided on the nihilist premise. I am sympathetic with either some nihilist view is correct or some very abundant view is correct. Universalism with in-cars and all the rest. The intermediate views seem unprincipled and unattractive in various ways. And so the version of the argument I would maybe prefer, given that I'm not decided on Mereological nihilism, is like either nihilism or some kind of very abundant view is true.
And the abundant leads to the many subjects problem.
If abundant, then physicalism leads to too many subjects. If nihilism, then physicalism leads to too few subjects, because there's no physical thing for me to be. So either way, we should go in for some kind of non-physicalism. Now, in the case of nihilism, I think it has to be like substance dualism. There's got to be like a simple soul. And that works very nicely with this thing, with the view that they're only mereologically simple things. Some of them are like elementary physical particles. Some of them are simple minds. And clearly I'm not any elementary physical particle, so I've got to be like a non-physical Cartesian mind. So I do think that there's some force to this argument. Here's one difficulty though that I think is worth raising. So suppose you want to rule out the very abundant views. There's still going to be a question among the relatively sparse views. Like, should I be, let's say, let's take the debate between the nihilist and Peter van den Wagen's view, which is sometimes called organicism. So Peter van den Wagen thought all that exists are simples and living things. Human animals exist, flowers exist, elementary particles exist, but chairs don't. Okay. Now, there are a lot of reasons to not like this view, but at least some of those reasons would also be reasons to not like dualism. So one reason to not like the Van den Wagen view is it has like very complex and arbitrary looking principles of composition. It says like, at some point when things get physically complex enough and in the right shape and in the right size and doing the right things, then and only then you get a new thing coming into being. There's also probably going to need to be extra laws for like when some things at one time compose the same thing as some different things at another time. So those are going to be very complex and kind of seemingly arbitrary looking laws, which I think is an unattractive feature. But notably, dualism has basically the same feature, which is like the dualist is going to need natural laws saying like when a set of physical simples gets to be associated with a soul, and also kind of diachronic laws of like when a set of simples at one time gets to be associated with the same soul as a different set of simples at another time. The laws aren't going to be perfectly parallel because like, there's probably not going to be souls given to like flowers and stuff, whereas there will be composites associated with flowers for Van den Wagen, but they will be kind of very similar, kind of arbitrary looking complex laws. Like to state the conditions in purely physical terms for when ensoulment happens or when composition happens on the Van den Wagen view, these will be very complex, arbitrary looking laws. So I do wonder, like, if your reason for rejecting organicism was some kind of distaste for arbitrary looking, inelegant, complex laws of composition, then it's a little bit weird to then jump in with substance dualism, which suffers from an exactly parallel problem.
If I could just briefly, I mean, like we might think that there's at least some relevant difference there insofar as, at least typically speaking, the dualists will take their laws to be contingent, and arbitrariness is a sign of contingency. So that maybe meshes better compared with like the metaphysical laws, which govern composition, which seem like this necessary truth of reality, which is like hopelessly arbitrary and complex. That seems to be a relevant difference.
Yeah, that was actually going to be the point I was going to make, that I do think that is a relevant difference. There's this intuition that like, arbitrariness should belong to the domain of the contingent, and laws of composition, it's at least popular to think that they are necessary truths. Now, I do think, there are views out there. I think Andrew Brenner has a view like this that accepts contingent composition. And if you do accept contingent composition, like the principles of when composition occurs are contingent truths, then the two views do look very parallel. So I guess at that point, if you're choosing between contingent composition with organicism versus substance dualism with nihilism, I think you're at least not going to decide that based on kind of complexity and arbitrariness of laws.
Right.
Now, I do think at this point, maybe someone like Dustin, who likes the nihilism combined with substance dualism, might fall back on some of the other motivations for anti-physicalist views, explanatory gap and so forth, and conceivability arguments.
Or other objections to organicism.
Yeah, or other objections to organicism. That's right.
One more argument against physicalism, and maybe it's not even an argument, but it's like this just too different intuition. Like, oftentimes like non-naturalists in the domain of metaethics who think like, oftentimes they'll just argue like, listen, morality and normativity just seems too different from like the descriptive empirical facts that science investigates, that they're just different kinds of things. They're different domains.
Yeah.
One of them has this like normative authority, this bindingness on you. And that's just totally different from the purely descriptive empirical goings on around us. And likewise, just reflect on your conscious experience and like the smell of lilacs and this, the taste of coffee and all these things. It's just, it seems so radically different from, like Hertz and, electrons and the movement of protons and things like that. Like, we have some grip on what these things are, and they just seem too different to be identical or to be one to be like constituting another or something like that. So what do you make of these just too different arguments?
I think they are good. I think they are expressions of just like philosophical good sense. I sometimes think this is just like the foundational like intuition. I mean, distinctness intuition. It's like, come on, this neural property is just not a phenomenal presentation of red. Those are just two different things. I mean, one analogy I kind of like is, imagine we look around the world and we find that there's a perfect correlation between round things and red things. The red things are all and only the round things. And this leads some of a reductive bent to suggest like maybe redness is roundness. I think a natural and sensible and correct reaction to that would be like, no, like there's redness, there's roundness. It's an interesting fact that they're perfectly correlated with one another. Maybe there's some law of nature that makes sure that they always go together. But like, can't you just see that it's one thing to be round, it's another thing to be red? And we can investigate the laws of how they're connected and how they're lawfully correlated. But any person of good sense can just see that these are two distinct properties. I kind of feel that way. Like, forget roundness. Plug in any physical property you like and replace redness with a phenomenal presentation of red. Like, can't you just see that, no firing pattern of neurons or disposition to behavior or whatever else is one and the same as a phenomenal presentation of red? And I guess I think this probably is like the deep motivation of a lot of anti-physicalism. It's just like, come on, like they're clearly different properties. And then all the other stuff about like zombies and
there are ways of trying to elaborate upon it.
It's like moves you make in order to try to get other people to see the thing that seems kind of obvious. It's like if someone claims like, oh, maybe redness is roundness, and like, well, then I might bring in my like
we can imagine,
my conceivability. Yeah, surely you can imagine something being round without being red. And the same dialectic would come. Like,
well, actually, there are these a posteriori necessities.
There's these chromatic concepts and spatial concepts, and they refer to the same properties. But and you could give variants on the Mary argument. But I think in the explanatory gap, these would all just be like different ways of trying to get people to see the thing that seemed pretty clear cut to begin with.
So there are different arguments against physicalism that we didn't cover. I just want to mention a few of them. Different like Leibniz's law arguments, like we might think that certain mental property, or we might think that minds have properties that brains and physical systems don't. There's also this puppet argument from Josh Rasmussen and Andrew Bailey, where maybe that's a little bit more aimed against reductive physicalism, but it's like a threat from reductive physicalism to our being free and responsible creatures. There's this counting argument that Josh Rasmussen has made, that there are more possible thoughts than there are physical configurations. He develops that in one of his Synthes articles. There are like determinacy arguments that Ross, Fazer, other people have developed. Basically, like our thoughts exhibit a certain kind, or at least the contents of thoughts exhibit a certain kind of like determinacy, but no physical system can be determinate in that way. There are lots of different arguments, but we're not going to go through those because I wanted to get to some arguments for physicalism and have you respond to them. So one main argument for physicalism that I want us to cover is, well, there are kind of two that I really want to cover. One is just like the hopeless complexity of psychophysical law. Like these, I mean, firstly, they're just weird. I mean, the psychophysical laws. We've got these like seemingly fundamental laws that are like neurocentric, that focus on brains, that only take effect like late on in the evolutionary history, like 13.8 billion years later, and which are concerned with only like a tiny little portion of reality, and a portion which may very well not have come into existence. So like there are these fundamental laws that care about neurocentric goings on. Seems really odd, weird, arbitrary, and moreover, not just that arbitrariness, but they're just like hopelessly complex. Like they relate certain macro level features of like biological brains under certain conditions to like super specific phenomenal properties. Like at the very least, this seems to be a big cost of physicalism, that it has these super complex, super arbitrary seeming laws that seem to be fundamental.
Yeah. Good. I see this as the biggest problem with dualism, bigger than any of the mental causation, causal exclusion, interaction, anything else, which I don't think are very serious problems. The kind of gnomic complexity worries I see as the main issue with dualism. And I guess I can see maybe three ways of responding. So maybe we'll walk through them, and I'll say what I think about each. So one is just, okay, and you get this in Chalmers' book, The Conscious Mind. Like, maybe there is some simple mapping. We haven't yet thought of it, but yes, it's true that there's some kind of mapping from macro scale features of the brain onto experiences, and it on the face of it, it looks like you wouldn't be able to describe those underlying physical conditions in simple fundamental terms. But maybe if we're creative enough, we will be able to find some simply, compactly statable set of laws for when something gets to be conscious. That's kind of like a promissory note. I agree with the appearance that like that doesn't look very plausible. I mean, especially if you want like the distribution of consciousness to be at all what we commonsensically think it is and not panpsychist. So we think like only, roughly animals or things with similar degree of complexity get consciousness, then yeah, probably there are going to be laws that don't kick in until billions of years after the Big Bang and operate on like very complex specific conditions that only appear in like terrestrial life and maybe other planets. It doesn't look like there's going to be any like neat, clean, tidy, compact statement of those. So the Chalmers line that maybe there will be some simple specification. That's not one that I put a ton of hope in. The second response, I guess this is kind of my default go-to, is this feature of the psychophysical laws, that they're extremely complex and inelegant and fundamentally different from other like known physical laws, is maybe less surprising when coupled with like a theistic picture of the world, which I'm happy to go in for, and maybe many of your viewers are, where the thought here would be, well, if mind or consciousness is the whole point of physical reality, or a big part of God creating a physical world at all, then maybe it's not so surprising that there would be special laws rigged up to kind of hook up mind to matter in fortunate ways, and maybe in ways that exhibit psychophysical harmony that we talked about in our last discussion. And I think you can make a case that the psychophysical laws that are most harmonious are probably going to be very, very complex. And the psychophysical laws that would be a lot simpler would not exhibit the same degree of harmony. So I think, that not like if you look at not just the fact that the laws are complex, but they're complex in just the right way to like generate a harmonious correspondence between the physical and the mental, that whole thing doesn't look so costly if it's combined with a background physicalism about like the point of like a big part of the point of the physical universe at all is to host mental beings, and you've got this theistic backdrop. I think the whole package looks less unpalatable, more attractive if it's combined with this theistic backdrop. I do think, there are dualists out there who are not theists, and I think this is a bigger problem for them. It's worth noting, like, so one of my advisors in grad school was Adam Pouts. He's basically a dualist. I think he and David Chalmers are two of the best like anti-physicalist philosophers of mine out there. I highly recommend reading both. But Adam Pouts, he's not a theist, but you see in a lot of his work, like these really powerful arguments against physicalism about consciousness, but then on the other hand, an extreme discomfort with the kind of mental primitivist views that he likes because of this combination of mental complexity and psychophysical harmony. So I think as of now, he doesn't really know what to say about these things. He thinks that these are major problems, major costs for dualism. They've got these super duper complex laws, and they seem lucky in a kind of fine-tuned way that seems to call out for explanation. I think if you're not willing to go in for something in the ballpark of theism or axiarchism or one of these views of the world, those features of the psychophysical laws should make you very uncomfortable and might reasonably press you to like rethink, the arguments for dualism or decide that the costs of dualism are weighty enough that maybe we should be physicalists after all and say the least costly things we can about the other arguments.
Maybe I know you said three things. Was the third? Well, this is one way that I might go about responding to this worry, and I'm wondering if you would agree with it or disagree with it. It's something like, I feel like this is a problem for everyone who's not an a priori physicalist. The a posteriori physicalists, it seems like they don't get for free that we had consciousness is associated with specifically macro level properties of the brain. Again, we can imagine, so long as it's at least imaginable a priori, that the psychophysical connections, let's not say that they're laws in the dualist sense, but whatever mappings from physical states to mental states, even if they're the same thing, even if there are grounding relations, whatever the mappings we specify, the a posteriori physicalist, just by virtue of saying physicalism, the bare thesis, you don't get these a simple mapping or anything like that. Your mapping is just as complex as the substance dualists in theoretical terms, and they basically just say, well, it's like a grounding connection instead of the laws, which are causal laws or something like that, or it's some sort of constitutive connection, or maybe it's even identity. But again, you don't get that for free. You still have to write in by hand into your theory that there are these connections, and they seem just as complex, arbitrary, lucky, etc.
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for that response, though I do think it maybe matters what kind of a posteriori physicalism we're dealing with. So I agree that if we're comparing dualism with ground physicalism, so ground physicalism is this view that Jonathan Schaffer defends, which says that phenomenal properties are not identical to any broadly physical property, but they're fully grounded in some sort of broadly physical properties. Adam Pautz makes this point, and I totally agree. There's not a relevant difference, and I think even Schaffer concedes this point. There's not a relevant difference on the nomological complexity worry between dualism and Schaffer's ground physicalism, where the dualist says we have maybe a contingent law of nature, Schaffer will say we have a necessary law of grounding. But I think even Schaffer will concede there's just as much pressure to make the basic grounding laws simple as there is for making the contingent laws of nature simple. So if we're just comparing those two, I don't think there's an advantage to ground physicalism over dualism. Where I think there might be an advantage is identity physicalism, which says that phenomenal properties are identical to some set of broadly physical properties. And the response there would be, well, isn't it nice to have simple identities? But I don't know if there's the same theoretical pressure to keep identities simple as there is to keep the fundamental laws of nature simple. I mean, one reason to think that is, if you have a very abundant view of properties, that you start with a stock of fundamental properties and then you just get arbitrary Boolean logical combinations of them. We already know there's just going to be zillions and zillions, infinitely many arbitrarily complex properties, and therefore there will be, identities with these facts about this property being identical to this property that will be arbitrarily complex. So I think the identity physicalists can say, well, there's just no theoretical pressure to keep our set of identity claims simple, or at least keep our psychophysical identity claims simple. Whereas I think there is reasonable theoretical pressure to keep the set of fundamental laws simple, or to keep the set of grounding laws simple. So I do think maybe ground physicalism and dualism are on one boat. Identity physicalism might be in another boat. But that deals with tricky issues about to what extent identities should be kept simple. And I don't know if I have fully developed views on that question. Actually, the third response I was going to say that I forgot earlier was a kind of like Nancy Cartwright dappled worldview. So I think, like when JJC Smart gives this like gnomic complexity objection, one thing he says is like these laws connecting the brain states to the experiences are going to be just like god awfully complex. But then the other thing he says is they're radically unlike like plausible candidates for physical laws. And the background picture here is like we have this view that like pretty soon, 20 years out, the physicists are going to discover the grand unified theory, and it's going to be some small set of basic equations, and those will be like the fundamental physical laws. And then if we tacked onto that this like hideously complex mapping from physical laws to phenomenal states, that just destroys our beautiful, elegant, grand unified theory of the cosmos. But there's this kind of dappled world Nancy Cartwright view that like that's not how it is. Physical laws are not these like comprehensive things that prevail in all domains and all scales and all times. Like they're these kind of, science is this patchwork of principles that are, the principles are limited in the domains in which they apply and in the context in which they apply.
Like ceteris paribus.
Yeah. And so, I think there's a real metaphysical question here about to what extent does the world correspond to this bias that many of us have, and I certainly have, that at least the physical domain will kind of bottom out in this small set of simple, elegant principles, this kind of like Leibnizian dream that all the high-level diversity will somehow boil down to like a beautiful set of elegant equations. If that's true, then I think tacking on the hideous psychophysical laws, that's like more of a cost. But if the Leibnizian dream is just a dream, and the dappled world is the reality, then I think the psychophysical connections are just more of the same. Like we can have a patchwork of psychophysical connections, just like we have a patchwork of physical laws, and the world is this like Gerard Manley Hopkins patchwork of interconnections that's kind of messy. So I do think your views on the plausibility of dappled world hypotheses will bear on how much weight you give to the gnomic complexity objections.
All right, well, thanks, Brian, for joining me. Do you have any concluding parting comments about physicalism, anti-physicalism, before I close it out?
Do I? I guess I'll conclude with this thought that this is a central question in the philosophy of mind, but I think it's not contained within itself. And this goes to considerations I was talking about with, whether you have a theistic or non-theistic background view can make it more or less comfortable to accept these complex psychophysical laws. I do think that the reason why questions about physicalism, about the mind, are interesting is they point to larger issues. They bear on larger questions about the kind of world we inhabit, the kind of reality we are in. So that I think is worth thinking in mind as you think through these questions.
All right, thanks again for joining me. And for the audience, I put links to Brian's work in the description, a number of his papers on physicalism, dualism, etc. And as always, if you like this video, smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications, consider supporting me on Patreon, and of course, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.